After sweeping the number 3 ranked Florida Gators, South Carolina is now the new number 3 team in the land. And someone had a chance to be able to watch it all weekend long is Collyn Taylor. And Collyn, what more? What more can you say about this South Carolina baseball team that we haven't already said before last weekend?
This might be the best team in the country. We might be looking at we'll talk about it later, but right now it's hard to argue that South Carolina is not one of the best 3 or 4 teams in the entire country when you look at South Carolina, Wake Forest, and LSU as your 3. And a team that, when healthy, which they haven't been over the last couple weeks, has a legitimate chance to win a national title, which is where we sit with 4 weeks to go in the regular season. And a season that so far South Carolina fans have been clamoring for, yearning for a decade now. And we're sitting here with 4 weeks to go and South Carolina firmly in the mix of not only national seed contention, but a potential to win the SEC outright.
And let's start right there, because they improved now to 34-6 overall, 13-4 in SEC play. They do it in dominating fashion against Florida. I don't think it was a question as to whether or not South Carolina could win the series this past week and going into it, but the fact that they just obliterated Florida, run ruled them on Friday night, and they just continue to find different ways to win. They just show that they're dynamic and they're not just a one-trick pony. They're not just a team that hits a bunch of home runs. They find different ways to win.
Yeah, they have an identity about them, which is not something you could have said, a couple years ago. They just don't have – they have an identity that wins you ball games. They have an identity that great teams have, and they can really pitch. Statistically speaking, they're the best pitching staff in the SEC right now from an ERA standpoint, and it's not even close. I think they're 40 points or 30 points ahead of Alabama right now in terms of team ERA. They can hit there, and it's not just home runs. They do the things you're supposed to do to win ball games offensively. They get on base and they hit for power. That is what good baseball teams do to win games, and it says a lot about this group that with no Noah Hall, no Will McGillis, no Talmadge LeCroy, and Gavin Costas not being available for the final 2 games of the series, you were able to go out there and not only win it, but sweep it and do it with behind your offense on Thursday, game 1, and then behind great pitching in game 2 and a little bit of both in game 3. And just really impressive weekend overall for South Carolina. And what I thought going in was a good matchup for the Gamecocks, and you see that come to fruition as of Saturday afternoon.
And as we put a bow on this past weekend series, it's hard not to start with Ethan Petrie, who on Monday was named the SEC Freshman of the Week for the 4th time this season.
We're just going to call it the SEC Ethan Petrie of the Week. How about that?
So multiple records have been broken. I know that there's more records on the horizon that he could be breaking in the near future. But what can you say about this young man, in particular, this past weekend?
It was really interesting to see, because this was, from a starter perspective, top to bottom, probably the best 3 starters he's faced in a weekend overall. And he goes out there and just dominates. And he hits a home run off hits a home run off Herschel Waldrop, who has been one of the best strikeout throwers, flamethrowers in the SEC. He goes out there and busts the game wide open on Thursday night in what I would consider probably the best piece of hitting I've seen from him this weekend, where he goes down 0-2, works it even, and then bloops a single into shallow left center field to score 2 runs and make it really put a game out of reach, and clinches the RBI record with what I want to say was a 2-strike double in the gap on Saturday afternoon. His swing stays in the zone. His swing, because he's such a big, burly hitter, when he barrels it up, it tends to go a long way, or it tends to come off the bat really hot. And when you do those things and you know the strike zone as well as you know the strike zone and you prepare the way he prepares, it's hard not to have the kind of success he's having. And you see that. And there were a ton of stars this weekend. Chris Veach with 2 saves.
Mm-hmm.
Will Sanders looking like the ace of this staff. Matthew Becker doing a lot of really good things. Jack Mahoney pitching out of jam after jam. Michael Braswell, Cole Messina, all of these guys. I mean, it was just a total team effort. And I think that was huge for South Carolina with so many guys down. You got an entire team effort, and you were able to go out there and just dominate a top 5 team in the country.
I've said this before about other sports, and particularly when we're talking about basketball, right? That rankings really mean absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of things, especially when you have such a tournament that's set up in the manner in which it is with baseball, right? I mean, it really means nothing other than, your seeding when it comes to the playoffs. I say all that because the Gamecocks move up to number 3. And while that is a good spot, I know there's going to be other people out there that are like, all right, maybe they should be higher. Maybe they should be 2, maybe even 1. What's your just overall thoughts on where South Carolina is right now? And do they have a case to make to be a little bit higher?
They do have a case. Absolutely. When you look at the RPI, which they're the number 1 team in the RPI, when you look at their quad 1 wins, their record against quad 1 and quad 2 opponents, very comparable to LSU and Wake Forest. And they've done it with what has statistically been a stronger strength of schedule, a harder schedule. There's absolutely a case to be made. I'm of the belief that it's hard to punish a team for losing a series. And Wake Forest and LSU both won their series this weekend. LSU swept Ole Miss, and Wake Forest absolutely bludgeoned Pitt in the final 2 games of that series to take it. And, so, yes, do they have a case? 100%. But if you're South Carolina, it's great to be number 1, but who was, Mark Kingston can ask the guys, who was number 1 in the country with 4 weeks remaining last year? And it was probably Tennessee, and Tennessee didn't make it to Omaha. So being number 1 on April 24th doesn't mean anything if you don't continue to play well. So, yes, while they have a case, it's not the grand scheme. If you're South Carolina, what you need is that top 8 seed. What you want is that top 8 seed, because that guarantees if you win your regional, number 1, it guarantees a home regional. And number 2, that means if you win your regional, you get to play at home again in the Supers. And they're 24-1 at home this year. You'd like to have that home field advantage down the stretch come tournament time. So, long-winded way to say, yes, they have a case, but in reality, what's most important is just getting a top 8 seed and making sure that if you continue to advance, you're at home the rest of the way.
And not to spend too much time on it, but for those who are interested, LSU comes in at number 1 this week for D1 Baseball's top 25 poll, followed by Wake Forest, South Carolina at 3, Florida drops from 3 to 4, Vandy at 5, Coastal Carolina at 6, Arkansas 7, and Stanford 8 to hit on those 8 in particular spots that Collyn was talking about and how important that is to be able to finish up there. A lot of shakeup, though. A lot of shakeup. East Carolina drops from 7 to 12. Virginia dropped from 8 to 13. So a lot of movement going on in this week's top 25 poll, and South Carolina certainly taking advantage of it by doing what they did against Florida. So, Collyn, with that being said, let's look ahead now. You're getting to the point of the year where, look, it's the end of April. We have 1 week to go. May, of course, is going to be a huge month. Huge month. South Carolina's put themselves in a great position to be able to host a regional. But at the same time, too, how critical will this month be, especially after mentioning the fact that South Carolina has a tremendous opportunity to be able to win the conference in the regular season?
Yeah, this is a huge month for South Carolina. I think things would have to go absolutely sideways for them not to host a regional, just given what their SEC record is. Usually teams host the SEC. In the SEC, you're typically a top 16 seed with 16 or 17 SEC wins. So they would need 4 wins over the final 4 weeks to clinch that up, which I feel pretty confident in. What's next is now, what does that look like from a top 8 spot? if you're South Carolina, can you get they're 13-4 in the league. Can you get to 20 SEC wins? Can you go 7-5 in your final four to get to 20 league wins? And if you do that, you're going to be a top 8 seed. Your RPI is going to be good enough. And right now, if you're South Carolina, the predictive metric on Warren Nolan, which kind of takes into account RPI and a bunch of different things, has South Carolina finishing 42-13 overall and 19-10 in the SEC. When you look at that, that's probably good enough to get you an SEC. It might not win you the SEC title, who knows, but it's good enough to get you a top 8. And if you're South Carolina, that's your number one goal because you want to be at home for the postseason. And looking at the predictive, now it switches every time. I've looked at this thing 6 different times over the last 2 days. It switches up every single time. But this one has South Carolina beating Auburn, winning that series, losing a series at Kentucky, losing the series at Arkansas, and losing a series to Tennessee. Do I think that's going to happen? Probably not. I think South Carolina is good enough to win a lot of those series down the stretch. But it's tough. I mean, Tennessee's a top 20 or top 30 RPI team. Arkansas on the road, top 5 RPI team. Kentucky, top 2 RPI team. And Auburn at home is 38th. So it's a tough schedule, but if you're South Carolina, you just went toe-to-toe with LSU, Vanderbilt, and Florida. You feel really good about what you're thinking. In South Carolina, my guess is will be favored in no less than half of their remaining series and probably 3 of the 4.
One last thing I want to add, Collyn. I didn't add this to our notes that we had before we started, but that home field advantage this past weekend, a sellout, Oof. 3 straight days. I know that's only happened a handful of times.
It's the 4th time in program history. It's since 2009.
Since Founders Park has opened up. This season, South Carolina is 24-1 at home. You and I, well, I would say you and I, we're not dummies. I think we are probably dummies, or at least some people out there would think that, at least with me. But I bring this up because we saw that this past weekend. And I say the dummy part because we're not stupid. If South Carolina continues to win, what's going to happen? You're going to have crowds like that. I bring that up because how valuable was that this past weekend? And that's not to take away from Mark Kingston, Monty Lee, or any of the players, but being there all 3 nights, having been there the last couple of years covering this team through the highs and a lot of lows, what was that like? Describe it for people who weren't at Founders Park this past weekend.
It was awesome. I mean, just when Founders Park is rocking and this team is good, there's very few places in college baseball that are cooler to play at. Very few, if not none. I mean, you're talking about just a really, really cool place to watch a baseball game. And I'm a sucker, man, for like the atmosphere, and I get sucked into all that stuff. And I just love the pomp and the circumstance and like a park that's buzzing before first pitch. And you felt it. I mean, you felt every minute of it. And Thursday, when that crowd's into it and South Carolina's drawing, I think 5 straight walks, 3 with the bases loaded with full counts. I mean, that place was nuts. That place was just going bonkers. And it was really cool. And you felt the energy around it. You felt there was a point on Thursday, and there was a point in every single game where I probably should have been working and doing my job, but I was just kind of sitting back in the press box, like taking it in, because fans have wanted this. Maybe not 34-6, maybe not 13-4 in the SEC or whatever. Fans have wanted this for such a long time, to be playing really, really, truly meaningful baseball in April, late April, beginning of May. And it's been few and far between. And to have those moments against a top 5 team, against an SEC East rival, it was a special weekend at Founders Park, and a lot of fun to be a part of and cover. And I'm excited to see what it looks like this weekend against Auburn, and then especially to end the year against a Tennessee team that not a lot of South Carolina fans have good feelings about.
That's right. No midweek game this week for South Carolina. They'll be back in action on Friday when they host Auburn at 7 on Friday night. Friday night, not Thursday. It's been a lot of Thursday games the last couple
Finally
weeks.
back to the Saturday
night. And you mentioned Auburn. Auburn is a team that has been struggling, 7-11 in conference play. They are just 3-9 on the road. So South Carolina, one of those series, I should say, you don't want to overlook, but certainly a team that is beatable. If you want to follow along, not just Gamecock baseball, but recruiting is going to start to pick up, especially in about a month. But the transfer portal is going to heat up. Basketball as well. Collyn's been all over that. Be sure to follow Gamecock Central for everything related to Gamecock athletics. He's Collyn Taylor. I'm Mike Yuva. Be sure to follow Gamecock Central this weekend as South Carolina takes on Auburn.